Well, today we're in Psalm chapter 74. Some of you may remember Princess Diana. It's been about 20 years or so since she has died. And the interesting thing about her funeral is that over 3 million people descended into London, and over 2.5 billion people watched that funeral. It is said that the roses that were thrown on the automobile, that the windshields could hardly keep them off. It was considered a national tragedy, a public tragedy, and not only national grief was expressed, but over 40 different countries watched the funeral. It was something, really something else. But I want to talk about another tragedy and disaster. This is the background of some Psalm rather 74. The temple had been destroyed, completely ruined. The people were devastated, and they were exiled into the Babylonian Empire. The people had been starved for nearly 2 years out of the Babylonian siege. It was just absolutely brutal. And so the people are in deep lamentation and grief. And so the psalmist is writing with that background in mind. And have you ever thought about what would you say or how would you pray after something that's happened in your life has been so devastating, that has brought you completely to ruin? You may have lost a loved one, or maybe your family has been broken up, or some health issues. But the idea that I'm trying to express, I mean, it's just absolutely a hole in your heart. And so, what would you say? How would you pray to God? And it's interesting because, as you well know, people react differently to calamity that happens in their life. Sometimes people are just stoic. You know, the British and keep the stiff upper lip. I remember hearing about the Duke of Wellington and that great battle at Waterloo, that the soldier that was standing next to him, his leg was shot off, and he says, "Oh, my leg has been shot." And Wellington looked at him. He says, "Yes, yes, it is," and that was it. And so sometimes, people are just stoic, and they pick up the pieces and move on. Other people, of course, they go into deep grief. It's all, and if they're not careful, it ends up in some real deep bitterness, and life just stalls. They can't move on, and not only is there the loss of a loved one, or the loss of something devastating in their life, but they kind of get lost in life themselves. And so, in this particular psalm, it's dealing with that kind of devastation where, you've lost your identity. The nation has been dispersed. Everything has been burnt down to the ground. People have lost their lives, and they're taking captivity, and they're going into a place that they've never been to. So that's the background of this whole psalm here. And so let's look real quickly in a few verses today with our brief time together in Psalm chapter 74. And here's how the psalmist prays to God in view of those certain things. "Oh God, why hast thou cast us off?" And the idea is sort of like, "God, why don't you care? You've cast us off." Now remember, the Psalms have a lot of things going in them. They're used in corporate worship, yet you'll see the heart that is pouring out in the Psalms. And by the way, actually in Psalm chapter 72, I believe, is the last psalm that is directly attributed to David. The majority, if not most of all, of the psalms that we're dealing with from now on are not psalms of David. And so it's important to remember somewhat of a context. But here the psalmist is asking, how long will you cast us off? He's not questioning God about the correctness of it. If you study the book of Jeremiah, that you'll see that the folks got what was coming to them, and yet it was very, very devastating. And sometimes it is. Sometimes the consequences of our rebellion and disobedience. And if you break the law and certain things, life can be awful, awful, awful bad. And there's always a fallout. There's always calamity. There's always innocents that all get hurt. So here you go. Why have you cast us off forever? And why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? So he's appealing to God that we are your people. We belong to you. And by the way, what you're going to see in this particular psalm, obviously there's an appeal to God about their circumstances, and they're asking God to do something. But a lot of it, as you read the psalm, is concerned about the glory and honor of God. Because I mentioned how people generally respond to this, but also the enemies do. And what you see in this particular psalm is that the enemies mock these people. They mock God. In fact, down in verse 10, he'll talk about how they even blaspheme the name of God. And I don't want to go into this direction today, but just as a reminder, don't you find it really something about the raw, coarse language people are using today? It's almost amazing, and it's so pervasive, and people have tolerated, and it becomes acceptable, and people take the name of God in vain so loosely today. And what I'm suggesting, we ought never be happy about that or satisfied with this. It ought to shock us that people are able or willing to do that, and to blaspheme the name of the only one who can save them. Isn't that just absolutely amazing? And so here he's speaking about God. We are your people. And it's interesting too, I think, that, and I know we're not going to get through this, but it's interesting, I think, in the next several verses, the question that comes to the surface: if you take God really, really serious, you're going to pray when you are in these kind of circumstances. The people who do not take God very seriously don't pray. And here's what he says. He reminds God of his promises and who they are. Notice this: remember your congregation, that is God's people, which thou hast purchased. You have redeemed them of old, and we're your inheritance. We are valuable and a treasure to you, which thou hast redeemed, this Mount Zion, wherein thou hast dwelled among the people. So what I'm saying is that in these situations, you take God serious, and if you do, you'll seriously pray. Now notice again, he'll talk about the enemies, and we just alluded to that a little bit in verse 4. We're just hitting some surface things right now that let you study this even deeper. The devastation is so, well, let's just say so devastating as you look in verse 5. Everything is laid waste, verse 5 through 12. And then what he does in verse 12 and following is he reminds God. It's not so much a reminder, but he appeals to God's great power, how God has been a savior and how he has delivered people out of all kind of situations and messes. And he'll even talk about the creation, God's power in the think about that. I don't know if we think enough about the creative power of God, because in the section he talks about how God had brought order to chaos. In other words, he's talking about God's great power, and God's able to do something. In fact, he can do exceedingly above Ephesians 3:20 that you can even think about or imagine, because he's able to do it. And then the final appeal, of course, is that in verse 20 through 23, again, going back, if you look at this, he's going to talk about the foolishness of people oppose God, but all for the glory and honor of God, that God would act. And so that's a sort of a glimpse of this particular psalm. I hope you read it and study that, and you'll find that when bad things happen to you, that you can go to God and pray to God, and there you can find comfort. And so those are some thoughts today on the psalm. And by the way, you might be thinking, if you're traveling with me through this, I missed Psalm 73. I didn't miss it. We're going to talk about it tonight, and I hope you'll join us at 7 o'clock tonight at church.